Okay, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to colleagues in Geneva. Good morning and good evening to our colleagues in North America, Asia, and around the world. My name is Raoul Renard, and I work at the Permanent Observer Mission to the United Nations of the International Chamber of Commerce. Most people attending this session would be aware that the digital trade environment is fragmented. I take a relatively expansive definition of fragmentation here, which could mean instances where one, individual jurisdictions pursue similar but materially different approaches to various digital trade issues, or secondly, significant disparities exist in the implementation of broad-based reform initiatives by individual jurisdictions, or thirdly, instances where jurisdictions actually do not share the same general objective with respect to a given digital trade issue. Regulatory fragmentation can operate as an accidental barrier for businesses seeking to transact across borders, rendering international digital trade unduly expensive for large enterprises and impractical for smaller ones. But today is not about doom and gloom, because we are focused on creative options to reduce fragmentation in digital trade policy development. And it is my pleasure to moderate this panel discussion on the topic, reducing fragmentation in digital trade policy, transparency, monitoring, and plurilateral negotiation. I am pleased to introduce today 4 esteemed leaders in the field. Though they are all PhD experts, allow my informal Australian nature to introduce them in alphabetical order by first name. So we are excited to hear today from Dr. Deborah Elms, founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Centre. Deborah is president of the Asia Business Trade Association, has served on the Trade and Investment Council of the World Economic Forum, and was a senior fellow in the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry's Trade Academy. Deborah received a PhD in political science at the University of Washington, an MA in international relations from the University of Southern California, and bachelor's degrees from Boston University. Deborah also publishes the Talking Trade blog, which I recommend reading if you don't do so already, and writes prolifically on trade agreement issues. Welcome, Deborah. Next, we have Dr. Javier Lopez Gonzalez. Javier is a senior economist at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate of the OECD. His recent work focuses on digital trade, on developing frameworks for the analysis of digital trade, including in the context of exploring what market openness means in the 21st century, on investigating regulatory approaches to cross-border data flows, and on identifying potential economic costs and benefits of digital trade. He has previously worked on the drivers and implications of participation in global value chains, co-authoring papers on global patterns of supply chain trade, the implications of global value chain participation for developing countries, the links between global value chain participation and wage inequality, and how SMEs can make the most out of global value chain participation. Javier holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sussex. Welcome, Javier. Third on our panel is Dr. Johannes Fritz. Johannes is the CEO of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade, a Swiss non-profit and the institutional home of the Global Trade Alert and the Digital Policy Alert initiatives. His work focuses on utilizing technology to bring transparency to public policy choice. He is an economist with a PhD from the University of St. Gallen and additional training in computational text analysis and machine learning at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome, Johannes. Last, but certainly not least on our panel is Dr. Kati Suominen. Kati is founder and CEO of Next Trade Group, a trade advisory firm helping governments, multilateral development banks, international organizations, and Fortune 100 corporations optimize public policy, lending strategies, and investments in support of trade and digitization in the 21st century global digital economy. Kati is a global thought leader in trade, development, and digitization. She has published over 100 articles, and her 10th book, Revolutionizing World Trade, How Disruptive Technologies Open Opportunities for All, was published by Stanford University Press just before COVID-19, actually, in November 2019. A trade economist, Kati received her PhD from the University of California, San Diego, an MBA from the Wharton School of Business. Welcome, Kati. Now, before we get started, can I remind and indeed encourage all of our attendees today to post questions in the Q&A section within Zoom and to engage in the chat if you wish. After an initial panel, we will be opening up the discussion and we'll be glad to receive questions from the audience. To start then, may I turn to Johannes Fritz. Johannes, could you walk us through the digital policy alert? Why was digital trade policy identified as a priority area in developing this tool? And what gap do you see the DPA filling? Johannes.
Well, thank you, Raoul, and thanks to the ICC for organizing this event and providing me with the opportunity to present our new initiative in this important venue. We launched the Digital Policy Alert as a tool to help decision makers identify the key policy choices that affect the digital economy and to avoid the accidental fragmentation of the internet or other unintended consequences. We, that is the team of the Global Trade Alert, we are now tracking the digital policy space because we view this as a highly active and very complex field that warrants considerable international coordination. Illustrating this high activity, on our public available website, we have now documented more than 450 policy or regulatory changes that were proposed or implemented just this year alone. And that's just in the few months since we have launched our activity trackers in April this year. We suspected a high level of activity going into this exercise, and we are now adding around 20 regulatory or policy changes every week. Reflecting the complexity of the digital economy, the Digital Policy Alert covers a broad range of policy domains, including data governance, content moderation, competition, but also taxation and other further classic economic policy tools, such as subsidies. Our aim is to help understand the high complexity and activity and support realizing the inclusive promise of the digital economy that we see out there. We designed the Digital Policy Alert to provide two novel data products to decision makers and the interested public. First, the activity tracker, which was launched in April and now includes the mentioned 450 changes for this year alone, but also several hundred for 2020 already. Our activity tracker is publicly available through our website. Its entries are based entirely on official sources that you can also find there. Plus, we provide a notification service so that one has all this information delivered timely and automatically to one's desk. With the activity tracker, we want to stay on top of this highly active policy space and help users identify the key issues that affect them. The second data product we have as a Digital Policy Alert will be what we call the detailed mapping. And we have designed it to speak to the very important issue of fragmentation. The detailed mapping takes each of those regulatory policy choices and characterizes it in a more detailed database to capture the different facets of a policy stance and to allow users really to compare the difference across countries and across time at a high level of granularity. This detailed mapping will be launched in the fourth quarter of this year. It will be highly interactive, an online tool, and also available through our site. With these two new tools, the activity tracker and the detailed mapping, it is our primary objective really to support decision makers and the interested public in understanding the digital policy and regulatory landscape. In particular, we want to support those organizations who cannot deploy their own resources to track and identify the key issues affecting them. And as the Digital Policy Alert, we want to provide these audience with an independent and trustworthy public inventory of the digital policy choices based on the reputation of the Global Trade Alert and our track record here.
Great, thanks, Johannes. So obviously really exciting to hear about the detailed mapping coming out and we'd love to hear more about the activity tracker. Perhaps as a further question, bringing greater transparency to what is a very complex policy area would seem to be a good in its own right. Already it's a good thing, but how can greater transparency also reduce fragmentation in the development of digital trade policy?
To me, transparency really helps build confidence among negotiators in an area where things are moving fast. Having a common factual base is an important, I think, ingredient for intensive negotiations in this very important area of the global economy, and thus help prevent fragmentation from emerging in the first place. Having this public inventory is also a common factual base, hopefully, that allows negotiators to have an eye on the future and spot the next big issue while they're still solving the key problems of the day. In this way, I think transparency also promotes the global inclusiveness as we can work off a comprehensive picture and work together on solving the issues that affect many of us. And I think finally, transparency can really help, because I would add that transparency in the policy and regulatory process is particularly important for the digital economy. Allowing public consultations and other broad forums of stakeholder engagement, such as we see here right now done in the multilateral setting at the JSI, I think is particularly relevant now. We don't know all the trade-offs that we are facing in our policy choices here, and thus hearing a broad range of inputs lessens the risk really of unintended missteps and fragmentation. So we, the Digital Policy Alert, really try to speak to this by the activity tracker and other mapping exercises to help people inform them quickly so they can engage with policymakers on important issues like these.
Thank you very much, Johannes. And can I remind everyone, we will be having a discussion after this session. So if you do have questions, please feel free to start sending them through into the Q&A. Now, moving on to a related or complementary initiative, if we could hear from Javier. Now, the notion of digital trade can itself be fairly confusing. We tend to see seemingly different but interrelated concepts fall within this notion of digital trade, from electronic payments and other services to cross-border data flows to goods trade facilitation. For this reason, digital trade has been referred to both as horizontal and as cross-cutting. Now, the OECD has just published a comprehensive inventory of instruments and agreements bearing on digital trade. Javier, how can we use the digital trade inventory to make sense of existing progress in the adoption of international rules on digital trade?
So first, let me thank you and also the ICC for the invitation. And it's very nice to be in a panel with old friends and new friends as well. Let me sort of start by saying that I think the notion of digital trade is indeed complex. And this is mainly why at the OECD we have this long-standing work on trying to shed more light on what digital trade is, but also on how we might go about measuring it. And as you mentioned in your introduction, on how we might approach market openness in the 21st century. And perhaps if you let me sort of just highlight two key points from that work, which feed into the debate on fragmentation. The first one is that digital trade really, really matters. And this is borne by the empirical analysis, which shows that digitalization means more trade in both goods and services, more exports of goods and exports of services for developed and also developing countries. And it's not limited to what we think is the production of high-tech products. When you're trading agricultural products, when you're trading metals, when you're trading non-digitally deliverable services, there's something in there for digitalization that you can benefit from in terms of your engagement in trade. The second element I want to highlight is that trade has become more complex. And by that, even though sometimes we think that it's easier now with digitalization, what I mean is that now trade involves a lot more actors and different transactions, many of which are now cross-border, which touch on issues that have not traditionally been discussed in trade circles. And so we have, to a certain extent, old issues which raise new concerns, but also new issues that raise new challenges. And talking to the point that Johannes was making, transparency is really important in that area. And so recognizing that complexity, what we aimed to do with our digital trade inventory was to help countries navigate this evolving environment, providing an inventory or some kind of repository of existing international rules, principles, standards that are of importance to digital trade. It's also our tool designed specifically as a companion to the JSI discussions. It's organized by matching the headings of the items that are being discussed at the JSI. And so it touches on the issues you mentioned, on e-signatures, e-payment, cross-border data flows. So it's easily searchable for those engaging in JSI discussions. It's both an exercise in transparency, and Johannes again said a lot of important things about transparency, but also facilitating access to information, which is often difficult to identify and very rarely present in a single database. And it's a bit different and complementary, as you mentioned, Raoul, to the Digital Trade Alert, but also to a tool that we've developed at the OECD, which is the Digital Services Trade Restrictiveness Index, in that both of these tools focus on domestic regulation, whereas our digital trade inventory focuses on international discussions. So back to the digital trade inventory, it has two components. The first is an inventory of international instruments, which identifies the issues covered, participation, and some of the language being used. So for example, if you're discussing things like a cybersecurity, The inventory will point you to something like the Budapest Convention and will tell you a bit about what it is, or it will point you to the OECD recommendations on digital security, risk management for economic and social prosperity, showing who's implemented it and again, what it tells you. And the second element of the inventory are sort of an inventory of regional trade agreements. And this is based on the excellent work that Mira Burri and Rodrigo Polanco had done. And we summarize that and sort of extend that in a way. And it matches as well the headings of the JSI discussions, allowing countries to see whether or not others have already committed in their FTAs to different issues being discussed. So for example, it will look at cross-border data flows and will identify who has committed and the different bindings in that. But also, I think importantly, it will give a link to language that's being used in other trade agreements. And so we undertook this exercise because we wanted this to be a useful tool for both the JSI, but also for non-JSI countries to navigate this evolving and complex environment and to enable those more informed discussions on digital trade. Of course, in the context of the JSI, but also important in the context of domestic discussions and RTAs, in the hope that this would lead to less fragmentation in trade policy. If you know what your neighbor is doing, perhaps you might follow suit and say, okay, well, that's interesting. We should maybe try and use similar language or ask or learn about the process that they went through. Also, given the richness of the information, we developed an online compare your country tool, which will help you navigate the inventory. And so I invite participants to sort of search for the digital trade inventory on Google or on whatever browser they're using, or to contact me for a link. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Perfect, thanks, Javier. I think you sort of touched on this by reference to how the sections are categorized following the e-commerce JSI classifications. So obviously of tremendous use for e-commerce JSI negotiators, but how might the inventory and compare your country tools also be a resource for non-JSI members also?
So I think it's important to highlight some of the emerging results from the inventory and from the exercise. I mean, the inventory itself is a sort of a repository, but we derived some lessons from it. And the first one is that it really shows the complexity of the evolving environment. So it identifies 52 instruments directly relevant for digital trade, which are being discussed in over 24 different institutions. This is sort of the WTO, but also UNCITRAL, UNCTAD, ISO, OECD, and many others. The second is that it can be used to identify where there might already be emerging consensus, so low-hanging fruits. So clearly the inventory already shows that in the area of trade facilitation with progress at the WTO, there's quite a lot, but also electronic transactions with the wide adoption of many different UNCITRAL instruments. In passing, it's also can also show where there's less consensus, even in some UNCITRAL instruments. I'm thinking of e-transferable records, where there's a very low adoption of model law and electronic transferable records. The third is that there's a strong degree of complementarity between the different international instruments. So they really quite regularly reference each other. So the UN guidelines for consumer protection in e-commerce cite the OECD recommendations, and trade agreements have either references to UNCITRAL or to the OECD privacy guidelines or to the APEC CBPR rules. The fourth is the strong progress that's been made across different issues in the context of regional trade agreements, really showing that many countries have already bound commitments in many of the areas discussed at the JSI. And the last is that there's substantial uptake of instruments on issues related to digital trade, which is true for JSI participants, but also for non-JSI participants. So in terms of sort of more directly to your question, understanding that many non-JSI countries may also have limited resources, we hope that they can find this database useful to understand what others are doing in this space and what context the issues are being discussed in. So for example, we have a glossary tool, which should be, or we hope to be, particularly useful to identify language in the specific provisions of the trade agreements. Or they might want to use the links that we provide to go into the UNCITRAL and the OECD texts and see what they're actually saying. And what we also hope is that non-JSI countries are able to see that they themselves have already made progress across a number of areas that are being discussed at the JSI, whether in the context of those international instruments, but also of the RTAs. And ultimately, we hope they can use this tool domestically as well to make a case for further involvement in the JSI, but also when they join the JSI, if they choose to understand who's doing what and to be able to try and contribute to that reduction in fragmentation in digital trade as countries see what others are doing. Let me leave it at that, and I'm happy to delve further into some of the issues covered and how maybe they can also help reduce other aspects of fragmentation.
Thanks very much, Javier. That's fantastic. So you mentioned RTAs. Well, using that as a segue, Kati, you have recently published 2 pieces of a 5-part series on the Comprehensive and Progressive Achievement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP. And part of the story, I understand, is that e-commerce has exploded in the region during COVID-19. You've also built and led since 2017 the Alliance for E-Trade Development, with 11 major corporate partners in USAID, and produced 2 sets of mappings of how developing countries are adopting policies conducive to MSME e-commerce. Can you speak a little bit about this work and about the role the CPTPP's e-commerce provisions have played?
Definitely. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me, Raoul. And thank you all for participating. I'll share my screen. I have a few slides to paint the picture, so to speak. So as Raoul mentioned, we've had this journey in my company over the past 6 and 7 years to think about how to enable particularly SMEs in e-commerce. And we started this about 6 years ago, realizing that there was very little actionable information for donors and corporations on how SMEs are using e-commerce and how we could, what challenges they were facing and what they needed to grow their e-commerce business. And so we did some survey work with USAID at the time to exactly get at those questions and ask SMEs across developing countries, how do you use e-commerce and what benefits you're gaining and so on, what do you need? As I went to present this work in different developing countries and emerging markets, from Mexico to Bangladesh to Kenya, people said, well, this is wonderful, this is very useful for us, but what do we do now? What are the policies that we should be adopting in order to enable SME e-commerce? And at the time, I really didn't have very good answers. And so we went and built the Alliance for E-Trade Development with 4 corporate partners back in 2017. And so to answer exactly this question through a mapping of policies in 40 different developing countries across 75 different policy domains, both kind of digital regulations as well as SME-related rules and programs such as export promotion programs. And we have now in the second E-Trade Alliance that we started in 2019 that has a much more robust corporate partnership. We have expanded this mapping. So what we see market after market as an empirical regularity, we've done a lot of survey work with our clients, is that companies that are selling online that are leveraging global marketplaces are likelier to export. Now, they may be likelier to export because they self-select into e-commerce, exporters self-select into e-commerce, but we also find in these surveys that companies have been able to start to export because of e-commerce. So that's kind of the motivation for this. And what we have done in the past year is we have taken 52 countries, kind of some benchmark emerging markets as well as advanced economies, and then several developing countries from different regions of the world, and mapped 100 policies in 10 different policy domains to understand how developing countries are adopting policies conducive to e-commerce. So rather than thinking about kind of trade restrictions or indices of restrictiveness, as Javier has developed, we're thinking about how do we enable e-commerce and what are the policies conducive to e-commerce. This gives you a sense of the kinds of policies that we have mapped, just a sample of them in different buckets. Perhaps most pertinent to you are kind of digital regulations like cross-border data flows, online dispute resolution mechanisms, treatment of internet intermediaries, taxation, and so forth. There's also, digital signatures, those kind of the basics of online transactions that we mapped, and then SME-related programs and policies that are not necessarily, don't necessarily have to do with regulations. Of course, these kinds of data lend themselves to all kinds of exercises of this kind to understand where countries' strengths and weaknesses lie in these different areas. And of course, given that we had the mapping from 2018, we're able to now compare countries' progression in 2020. So who are the biggest gainers? We see kind of India, Argentina, Japan, Canada growing in this, but everybody's making progress in adopting these policies conducive to SME e-commerce. And what I found presenting this work market after market for policymakers is that they are particularly interested in the actual case studies. Well, how did other countries do these reforms? What were the challenges that peer economies in particular, not necessarily the highly advanced economies, but peer economies faced and so forth in doing these policy reforms and adopting policies. And they also want to gain a sense of what their neighbors and peers are doing in general and how and what their own governments are doing, since there are many agencies involved in these policies that we have been mapping. We've also been able to, perhaps taking inspiration from Javier and others at OECD, to map kind of the similarities and differences in digital regulations, getting at an index of similarities within these different subregions across regulations. So we see kind of a Southern Cone, Middle East, more convergent in digital regulations than, say, Southeast Asia. And of course, we could, develop these kinds of huge mappings of pairwise correlations of how convergent are the different digital regulatory policies among countries. Now, to your point, Raoul, about the CPTPP, so we've been doing this work with publishing with CSIS. I'm a fellow there as well. And we surveyed firms. This is a 5-part series, right, of articles on how CPTPP is impacting firms, e-commerce in particular. And we asked firms about their views about the CPTPP e-commerce chapter that I'm sure everybody here is very familiar with. And firms tended to indicate, these are small and micro firms, that many of these provisions, such as ability to move data across borders and access customer data, ability, to trade freely on digital goods, and of course, certain market access issues are very beneficial for them, particularly those firms that are selling online and exporting. These gains are even higher for mid-sized and large firms. Then we asked companies about their main policy challenges. Well, what are the main challenges for you? And over, data privacy rules, consumer protection rules come up as the top challenges. And of course, this, to the point of this panel, the fragmentation, the differences in digital regulations across markets is a big deal, both for exporters and non-exporters in different markets. So we can look at, say, Mexico, Vietnam, and companies in general find these different regulations not only challenging to understand, but also to navigate across the different markets when they are selling across world markets. We, of course, find that the companies that are exporting and selling online are also using data intensively across borders, and that is perhaps reflective of the concerns that firms express about access to or digital regulations and data transfer rules in particular. So we've actually done recently work with USAID on African firms and asked similar questions. And we have found that the concerns are very similar, right? Companies are concerned about data privacy rules. They don't necessarily understand them. And they also are worried about navigating foreign digital regulations and again, the kind of differences across markets in these regulations. So to leave you with a couple of, we've been inspired by some of the work that Javier has done looking at the CPTPP and taking a set of RTAs and trying to categorize RTAs in those that address only trading goods, trading services, those that address goods and services, and then those that have digital trade provisions that are robust, that are CPTPP-like, that are kind of USMCA types of regulations. And we have sought to understand the kind of value added of these different RTAs, taking them apart. So much more coming up on this with CSIS as well. I'll leave it at that, Raoul. So we have found indeed, as Javier has found, that digital rules and agreements do have value for digital trade in services, digitally deliverable services, as well as goods.
Thank you, Kati. And very interesting that privacy and consumer protection and data protection come up time and time again as real issues for firms grappling with this challenge of moving online and engaging in digital trade. To follow up, what lessons can be drawn from the CPTPP e-commerce chapter that may be of use to the e-commerce JSI discussions? And how should we think about the many other e-commerce related policies to enable MSME e-commerce?
Yeah, very good question. So, as I've been doing a lot of this kind of survey work across markets, we've probably surveyed by now 60 to 70,000 firms across, 60, 70 markets with different clients and partners, private sector, as well as, multilateral development banks. You kind of get a sense from this work, and then, of course, by working with firms as well, of what are the challenges that they face. And we over and over see these patterns that I highlighted. I think as I reflect on this, and we think kind of back 30 years, and firms out there, big and small, particularly large ones, started to demand rules that were conducive to global value chains, right? They wanted rules that enable cross-border services and investment and of course, market access, but kind of packages of different rules to facilitate trade at the time and value chains in particular. Today, firms, large and small, want rules that facilitate their e-commerce, their digital trade in different markets. And e-commerce, the beauty of e-commerce is that it enables firms to diversify across markets more than ever. So I think we see this in surveys, and hopefully we'll see it in further trade agreements as well. And the work that colleagues here are doing is that we have, first of all, clarity for firms on rules of the game. We find that firms want to have rules that protect the consumer. They want to have transparency, and they want to have clarity and implementation of those rules. And they also want to have the freedom to be able to move and store and analyze data across their different customers in different markets. Firms seem to prefer, as we ask them in CPTPP region or ask them in Africa or in Latin America, they really like these kinds of CPTPP and USMCA types of robust digital regulations that are quite detailed as well. And I think firms look for greater kind of convergence of these rules, certainly that they wouldn't have to comply with such diversity of rules in different markets, but they could, use rules that are kind of similar across different markets. And that's where the work of this group is very important, I think, to provide greater coherence, right, for the set of rules around the world. So I also think that from some of this work that colleagues here have done and we've done in mapping out regulations, there's also a lot of opportunities for lessons learned for governments on not just what the rules are, but how to go about implementing them. So, I think for this group in particular, the coherence and bringing greater coherence in the body of international rules is really, really essential. And then, of course, facilitating firms that are even, micro multinationals that are able to trade now across different markets on the back of e-commerce.
Great, thank you very much, Kati. And I certainly agree that the greatest opportunity perhaps to reduce fragmentation and to arrive at convergence, as you say, is this e-commerce JSI negotiation. I hope that's really coming to the fore in this discussion. If I could turn now to Deborah. Deborah, you spoke powerfully about the importance for SMEs of coherence and consistency in digital trade rules at a recent UN SCAP event. Open accession digital economy agreements are relatively recent innovations in international trade, which seem to offer a path forward for promoting policy coherence. What lessons should we draw from digital economy agreements and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement in particular in thinking about the e-commerce JSI discussions?
Fantastic, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on a panel with people who've done so much work on this area. And you can see that all of us have spent a shocking amount of time, I would say, working on mapping in particular, in this sort of fast moving landscape, and how much time and effort it takes to actually keep track of it all. So I'm delighted to have so many different sources of information, because without that, policymakers are ending up creating policy basically in a vacuum. I mean, they think they know what they're doing, but actually they have no idea, and they have no idea what their neighbors are doing. And so I think it's absolutely vital to have different ways of looking at the digital landscape to be able to provide that kind of information that you need in order to make sensible policy. Because certainly in the digital space, policy matters, and policy always matters, of course, but I think policy may matter more in the digital space just because it impacts everyone. I mean, even places that you don't think of as being affected by domestic digital rules end up affected by domestic digital rules because of the nature of digital trade. And so I think it's especially crucial for all of us to have more information about what others are doing and why. And I think, again, all this mapping exercises, I think, is a lot of work and a lot of time, but thank goodness someone is doing it. And please do pay attention to all of these resources. Some of it comes into play when we look at some of the newest initiatives in digital, because the JSI has been proceeding, I mean, for WTO at a speedy pace, but for business at a less than speedy pace. And because it's challenging to get members to agree in a larger and larger setting like the JSI on digital rules, lots of governments have started switching to discussing digital or e-commerce or both in smaller spaces. So in existing bilateral agreements, beefing up, especially in Asia, beefing up their bilateral e-commerce chapters in FTAs, or they have started creating regional agreements. And so I would point, for example, to ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. ASEAN is finally about to implement the e-commerce agreement that they signed in 2018. So for the next 5 years, we'll have the implementation of the ASEAN e-commerce agreement, which is excellent. That will help increase the coherence of policies across ASEAN. So that's 10 countries in Southeast Asia. That's one way that the region has opted for having less fragmentation, is to anchor rules in these regional agreements like ASEAN's agreements, CPTPP that Kati mentioned, also RCEP, although RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, brings together all the countries in Asia, but it has a very weak set of policies that are specific to the digital landscape because there was too much diversity at the end and not enough buy-in by members about what were crucially important rules that should be anchored in an RCEP and what were rules that were just a bridge too far. So you see this sort of challenge that you get in the JSI and elsewhere between those who are extremely enthusiastic about digital and ready to be advanced and those that are more cautious. And that cautiousness ended up making a chapter in RCEP in particular that's sort of weaker than it should be, especially for a very digitally connected part of the world. So then there's another approach. So if you can't do this at the JSI level and you're struggling in some ways to do it bilaterally, because digital, frankly, bilateral digital rules is useful, but not as useful as you would like. Regional agreements, also awesome. There's another approach now that's increasingly sweeping through government, at least government enthusiasm at the moment, which are these digital only agreements. And we have two varieties of them going on right now, particularly in Asia. So we have the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, or DEPA, which is a purely independent standalone trade agreement that just deals with digital. So it's all by itself thinking about digital. Then we have a second group of these things called the Digital Economy Agreements. I didn't name them, so apologies for the for the overlap between names, but the DEAs are part of an FTA. So they're like a bolt-on to an existing trade agreement. Now, the difference between them is that in the DEA, you have access to the entire infrastructure of a trade agreement, including all of the other elements on trade and goods, in services and investment, in intellectual property rights, all of the infrastructure around an FTA, the committees that meet regularly, and the dispute settlement system. So a DEA can go further than a standalone digital agreement simply because of the infrastructure. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which people are very enthusiastic about and which continues to have momentum, I think, slowly building momentum with Canada and Korea, for example, expressing interest in joining the DEPA. Is a novel approach. And the point of the DEPA, which has been signed by Singapore and New Zealand, is enforced by Singapore and New Zealand and also negotiated with Chile, is that we have this diverse set of rules, as we've all mentioned. Wouldn't it be great if we could sort of harmonize around a core set of modules, and we could create different modules for different elements, and then governments sign on to that. Either in whole, you join Depa, or in part, you take a Depa module and you stick it in some other venue. You stick it in an FTA, you stick it in DEA, whatever. So that was the original intention behind the Depa. Let's make a digital-only agreement that we can build out and we can reduce fragmentation. That was the specific point of Depa, by either everybody joining Depa or by the people using Depa as a model, and then you just keep replicating the modules in different venues. Now, one of the challenges that we found in Depa is that it's hard to satisfy everyone. This is, at least let me rephrase, this is my assessment of Depa. Governments may have very different assessments. I think it's very hard to satisfy everyone. And so one of the problems that you have in Depa is that really enthusiastic countries that want to embrace the digital promise tend to look at the Depa modules as too thin, because they have, like, the modules themselves, the ideas embedded in them, excellent, but the actual commitments are lighter than many really, progressive, forward-leaning countries like. But they're also too progressive and a bit too scary sometimes for countries that are less enthusiastic about sort of digital commitments, especially about locking in consistent digital commitments. And so you see this tension in Depa, which is partly why I think it hasn't really expanded like people imagine, because it's one of those Goldilocks problems, right? It's not good enough for some and it's too much for others. And so we're trying to land in a sweet spot in the middle, and that's actually a challenge to do. But I think that as you get more countries that are interested in joining Depa, you may be able to get more momentum behind it, and it will do what it was intended to do, which is to help reduce fragmentation by having governments sign on to Depa. And then my last point before I stop this, what's turning out to be slightly longer than I anticipated, is the connection between Depa and the JSI. I think most of the countries that are enthusiastic about Depa would say JSI is better because it's bigger, and bigger is better in digital. Well, the more consistency, the more regulatory alignment we have, the better. But if you're not going to get a lot of movement in JSI, or it's going to take years to do so, then Depa is a nice alternative, and it would allow us to have less fragmentation in a shorter amount of time. So whatever, for many governments, it's whatever pathway works, we'll sign on to it, because the goal is to have increased digital trade, because it benefits all of our firms from the largest to the smallest, and trying to get consistency is a key issue that governments are certainly grappling with at this time.
Thanks, Deborah. A really interesting takeaway about how we should be thinking about Depa vis-a-vis the e-commerce JSI. To continue with the JSI, the document itself refers to a high standard outcome. And there are, of course, differing views on what may or may not constitute high standard. The pace of innovation in the digital sphere means that even the highest ambition agreement, the highest standard outcome, will miss emerging issues or will quickly become outmoded by digital advances. Are there innovations we should be thinking about to enable an eventual e-commerce JSI agreement to be readily updated, to, if you like, future-proof it through careful design?
I think that's a great question, and it's clearly a challenge. I think one of the things that's striking to me about CPTPP is that the rules have stood up fairly well. Remember that digital timelines are so short compared to trade agreement and typical trade discussions. So CPTPP is an old agreement if you're in the digital space. But the rules have stood up fairly well because I would argue, part because they're broad and they're a bit flexible, and they're less sort of in the weeds and in the details, which may turn out to be a good thing. But it does lead for potential for fragmentation. One of the innovations that I personally think is fantastic around one of the DEAs, the digital economy agreements between Singapore and Australia, is the addition of MOUs. So what they did there, which I think this is a model that I would love to see elsewhere, but it doesn't solve our fragmentation problem, is you have a core set of commitments in the agreement, fantastic. But then there's a bunch of stuff that's new and evolving, and we're not quite sure how we should regulate that yet. And so how do we handle that? In the Singapore and Australia DEA are a series of MOUs that are attached to it for things like artificial intelligence, or you can imagine, I don't know, pick one, pick your favorite, Internet of Things. It could be anything, where you say, we're not yet ready to create binding rules. We're not yet ready to know what those rules should look like, but we know it's important. And so let's have in here an MOU that allows us to have cooperation commitments, but crucially sustained interaction between ourselves about what should we be doing. And then at the time when we think we've got something that's ripe and ready to be added to the agreement, you take it out of the MOU and you stick it back in the agreement. That kind of flexibility, I think, is great, especially in the digital space. The challenge, of course, is, well, how the heck would you do that in the WTO, which is not known for its flexibility, and they don't do MOUs. And so I think at the minimum, what you will need is an ongoing work program attached to the JSI initiative that will allow you to address specific topics that we know are issues that need to be addressed, and then evolving topics, because if you do a good job with these agreements, they're going to last for quite some time. And so you need to be able to have a platform for that engagement. And then one thing that the WTO will have to do, but it clearly hasn't done a good job of it in a very long time, is speed, move with a bit more speed. So how can we then, assuming we have a work program in place, which is a big assumption on its own, but if we had a work program in place, is there some way that we can commit to moving things out of the work program faster and into whatever is the commitments that we're making? Because if we stick stuff in a work program and we just discuss it for eternity, then that's not very helpful, especially for firms. So we have to have a mechanism for both having a work program and then anchoring stuff that's ripe back into the agreement. And that is a kind of flexibility that the WTO hasn't really shown a whole lot of ability to manage. But I think in the digital space, it has to be done. Otherwise, we are ending up with rules that are still way behind where businesses are. And the possibility for fragmentation just continues to escalate.
Thank you, Deborah. That's a really interesting takeaway. We'll move to the Q&A portion now of the discussion. Please do send through some questions. It's relatively quiet thus far. So if I could kick it off then, that was a really interesting point that Deborah just made in terms of an e-commerce JSI work program to continue spotlighting emerging issues and negotiating new commitments as technology advances. If I could open it to the panel, does anyone else have any reflections on that as an option to future-proof in a way, or to ensure the continued relevance of the e-commerce JSI initiative? Kati, Javier, I see your hand up, please.
Javier, please go ahead.
No, I was going to break the ice, so go ahead.
Yeah, please, do it.
I mean, I don't want to say too much. I mean, I thought that what Debbie was saying is very thought-provoking. I mean, I think that if anything that I've learned from the exercise that we've been undertaking and from listening to Johannes and from Kati now, is that there's already a lot out there. So I just wonder about the different appetites for binding or non-binding rules. So for instance, if we look at cross-border data flows, my colleagues in the Science, Technology and Innovation Department have been working on cross-border data flows since the 1980s, 1970s, and there are actually non-binding provisions on or agreement on the importance of, they used to call them trans-border data flows back then. So I wonder to what extent we are able to fit these sort of the non-binding and the binding elements to this, and whether, as you say, that the JSI might be where we go for the binding and then we use the others as complementary agreements for non-binding discussions that then ultimately make it into the JSI. So maybe what I'll put there is that maybe the DEA and the Depa can all be the playgrounds for developing these rules that then are discussed at the JSI. But that's just a thought off the top of my head.
Thanks, Javier. Kati, did you have a perspective on this?
No, just to endorse what Deborah was saying, you know, I think as technologies evolve, we have to have a change in the technology of making trade regulations as well. And these flexibilities that governments have now introduced in these upgraded agreements or digital-only agreements are very welcome. And of course, you know, the accession for new members, you know, there's a lot of interest obviously around say CPTPP or Depa, and how do we accelerate the accession and kind of docking members into these blocks that want to join, that also that process could be perhaps a little bit more flexible as well, if we're bottom up seeking to come to coalitions that enable digital trade at the regional levels.
Great, thank you. And in response to this discussion, we are seeing some questions come through. One is, how big is the added value of digital trade rules, often soft obligations, versus existing trade rules on goods and services, mostly hard rules? And then I suppose a related question that's come up, do non-binding digital rules have value? Now, if perhaps first we could go to you, Kati, and then take it through the panel.
Well, first of all, I think, I guess these non-binding rules are good that they socialize countries to some sorts of rules and just thinking about rules. But overall, of course, we want rules to be binding in order for countries and companies to have certainty about the obligations of different governments in order to enable digital trade. So I would absolutely, vouch for binding rules. As we've, looked at some of this work to Johannes's question here, how big is the added value? From the kind of economist perspective, we're seeking to answer exactly that. We're seeing that there is added value if you're seeking to dissect and disaggregate agreements that have only kind of regulate only trading goods and services versus those that have goods, services, and digital rules. And this early work shows that there is unique value in these kinds of agreements. And I think Javier has also been showing that in his work. At the same time, we're dealing with relatively, if we're focused on the agreements that are very robust, that have robust digital trade provisions, the time that those agreements have been in place is still very short. So the time series is still very nascent. At the same time, I think we're seeing the benefits not only for goods, but also for services and digitally deliverable services based on this relatively short time frame. So I would imagine that in, say, 3 or 4 years, as we have more data, we'll only have more robust findings to this effect. But definitely, I think the rules have to be binding, and this is the difference we see with RCEP and CPTPP. Is RCEP rules are not binding, and maybe they are helpful for countries that are entering and thinking about these digital trade rules for the first time. But certainly, CPTPP is superior, in my view, to RCEP in that sense, that the rules are binding and they are robust and very high quality as well.
Thank you, Kati. And perhaps to you, Javier, I feel like the last question, do non-binding digital rules have value, was based on your earlier comment about hard commitments in the JSI and soft commitments elsewhere. But also Johannes's question here, how big is the added value of digital trade rules? That's, of course, a lot of the work that you do. Javier, so what's your perspective on those questions?
I thought I'd get away without having to answer that by asking it in the first place. But I think the real question, and I'm going to sort of bounce that one to Debbie and to Kati, because the real question is, how do firms see this? But from the policy perspective, I see that there's this complementarity between binding and non-binding in the sense that you need non-binding agreements on issues in order to create binding rules. And so for me, those non-binding issues are extremely important because they lead to the bindings later on. And I also just wanted to echo what Kati said just now. I mean, spot on in the sense that it's extremely difficult to measure the differences in agreements, not just because of the time series, but we've been doing some work on cross-border data flows, also in terms of the way that the RTAs are phrased themselves with the different legitimate public policy objectives. So, how do you assess the language on cross-border data flows in RCEP versus that of CPTPP versus the one that's appearing in the EU UK agreement? It's really, really difficult to get to that. But I really do think that basically it's the firms that should guide us as to what is better in this area.
Thanks, Javier. Deborah, did you have a perspective on these questions?
Sure, I would say that, for firms, binding is always better because binding is clearer and there's less, there's still plenty of scope for disagreements about it, but it's less scope for disagreement than if you have a sort of soft cooperation commitment. And even in the binding rules area, because we have so many, or the increasing proliferation of rules, minor changes that Javier was just mentioning, minor changes in language between agreements can be significant, especially for firms. So a firm says, okay, I see that there's, for example, cross-border data flow rules in A, B, and C agreements, but they're slightly different in each one. And actually, crucially, it's not just the agreement, of course, always vital for firms is the implementation on the ground. So I can have the commitment, but if the implementation on the ground is different, then it doesn't really matter as a firm. Do I care whether that's a binding commitment or a non-binding cooperative commitment? If at the end of the day, what I get is fragmentation, I have fragmentation, and I don't really care as a firm where it comes from. What I care about is that it's not there. So if it means that having binding commitments is less fragmentation, a firm would say, great. If it means that non-binding cooperation that is actually implemented in the same way is consistent, firms would say, great. The end goal really is to ensure that you have consistency between markets. And that matters not just to large global corporations who are active in 100 or 180 countries or whatever, but also to very tiny firms who are trying to do cross-border trade in goods or services with maybe just one other market. If the rules are not the same on all kinds of things, and it's not just about data, it's also about everything, right? If the rules are not the same around, how you protect data for consumers, or what you're allowed to ask, or what kind of payment structures work or don't work, or what the taxation regime looks like, then you can't engage in trade. Whether those rules are binding or not is, again, sort of irrelevant to you as a small business. The point is you can't do business. And so I think what we want is binding rules is lovely. Always advocate binding rules, but consistent binding rules crucial. And then just general consistency in implementation, absolutely vital for firms.
Thanks, Deborah. Johannes, if I could turn to you with those questions, but also to ask you, I think you mentioned that the activity tracker has already tracked some 450 different policy changes by governments and up to 20 a week in this year alone. Are there any trends, specific trends that you are seeing out of that tracking exercise?
Just to, before I get into that, one question also to add to Deborah's point, I think for policy consistency, there is a value even in non-binding rules, since they can set a reference point. I think with your question, you hinted there's lots of activity going on, and to coordinate at least somewhat, there is some rule in non-binding rules, although obviously we all prefer those to be a stepping stone to binding, and as you say, Deborah, consistent agreements, general rules. So yeah, for us, for the 450 policy changes that we have documented so far, I mean, by far the most active field is data governance, which includes domestic data protection regulation, but also recently the interest in cybersecurity regulation is already starting to see upticks there for requests about how standards should look. Some international coordination, but still tentative. And then, yeah, the classic probably data protection issue in this space, data residency and data transfer regulation. Also some activity there this year, although I say by far data protection regulation is the one that's leading the way for us. Besides that, I think in competition policy, there's also some very thorny issues for the international policy space when we come into questions such as, which has recently gotten into with Facebook versus Giphy, so Facebook acquiring another American company and then European courts getting interested in the case, or European competition authorities getting interested. So this is another one where I think international cooperation could help and will probably be called for soon. So data governance and competition, certainly two areas that we see highly active. Less so content regulation, and content regulation I think is also still a very much domestic issue, much like we know it from public broadcasting, in a sense that how you regulate the speech space in your economy is still very much a domestic affair. But those three are really highly active.
Thanks, Johannes. And it's funny, just as you were saying that, I had this thought perhaps for the first time that really this activity tracker provides kind of an unparalleled opportunity to actually guess what will be future hot button issues and what should be the eventual plurilateral or multilateral agreement or discussion topics. Such a valuable tool. If I could turn now to a slightly different theme, and that is that one of the themes that's arisen over the last few discussions within the e-commerce JSI is the experience of developing country members. And if I could perhaps ask each panelist, perhaps starting with Deborah, if you don't mind, how should developing country negotiators in particular be looking at, in your case, the open accession agreements? So whether it's Depa or the digital economy agreements.
I think, I've made this point before, but I'll keep making it because I think it's true. So you can say to yourself, if you're a developing country especially, I'm not in JSI, and there's no consequences to that. But I would say that deciding not to join a JSI or not to be engaged in these digital policy things is a choice. You're making a conscious choice to be out of the rules that are setting the rules, frankly, for the next century. So there are going to be consequences, in my view, from deciding to stay out. Now, there may be very good reasons why you think this makes sense to you, but I think we need to be very careful about those choices and recognize that not doing something is a choice. And crucially in the digital space, the more you end up out of alignment with what will be the emerging consensus or the emerging set of rules or the emerging set of regulations, the more damaging it is likely to be for your domestic economy. And that includes not just your large firms, but also your tiny firms. And it includes the challenges that they will have in both importing or accessing digital goods and services themselves, but also supplying those into other markets. And so there will be, I think, significant consequences to being out of these agreements. Now, that doesn't mean you have to join an agreement, but it means that if you want to minimize the damage in the disconnect, you will have to align more or less with JSI rules, for example, or potentially Depa rules, whether you're in it or not. So for developing countries who keep saying, oh, I want the policy space and the flexibility, I have to say, just be careful with what you wish for on that. Because the more policy space you have in the digital world, the less digital you're going to have. And there are real world implications for those kinds of decisions.
Wow, very powerfully said. Thank you, Deborah. Katja, do you have a perspective on this, and perhaps what lessons are to be drawn from the CPTPP and the e-commerce chapter therein for, in particular, developing country economies?
Yeah, just to echo what Deborah was saying, 100% agree that there are risks of staying out that are probably higher than risks of getting in. What we see market after market and in the CPTPP region and other emerging markets, developing countries and advanced markets, is that COVID has dealt a huge blow on SMEs and their employment in different markets. And at the same time, e-commerce is, of course, booming and emerging as an opportunity for countries around the world to enable their SMEs to recover, get back in business, and to export. Our data shows over and over that we've done over the past 5 years, surveying firms in different markets, is that firms that use e-commerce, and particularly those that use global marketplaces, are much likelier to export and much likelier to be diversified across markets. And so I think governments are appreciating the power of e-commerce for firms, but then we ask about the challenges for firms to scale their sales on the back of e-commerce. That's now a historic opportunity for small businesses in particular to grow into micro multinationals and sell across borders. And we over and over see these challenges of differences in regulations, firms not necessarily knowing, not being able to keep up with the regulations. And Johannes is cataloging the rapid changes. This is a very dynamic space, and it poses new challenges for firms just to even know what's going on, and then to comply with complicated rules, data localization rules, or very onerous consumer protection rules. So there's the kind of restrictive rules, and then there's the diversity of rules across markets. So, I would echo Deborah that, it's better to be in these agreements, better to look for opportunities wherever we can, at the regional level, at the multilateral level, to have a much more coherent set of rules for firms, and of course also do the homework at home to implement these agreements, and then to educate firms about the different digital regulations. I think we've done a lot of work as kind of trade community in helping firms understand market access rules. Export promotion agencies have done this type of work for years. And now there needs to be much more work also to enable firms to understand the digital regulations, and technology can help. Like, we have sophisticated RegTech technologies that could be applied in this space in a scalable fashion to enable small firms, perhaps even at the regional level, kind of as a regional public good. But in general, I think absolutely vital for countries to appreciate that these digital regulations have a direct impact on small firms in their countries that are seeking to grow and recover from COVID, and create new jobs as well. And firms demand better rules, much more coherent rules, binding rules for engaging in e-commerce.
Thank you, Kati. And Javier, the same question for you, but applied to the inventory and the compare your country tools. Now, you touched on this briefly when speaking of non-JSI members, but I certainly don't want that to mean a proxy for developing countries. We have, a lot of developing countries in the JSI already, obviously, with 86 members. But what does the inventory show, and how should developing countries in particular be using it?
So yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's also, I think we're all in complete agreement in terms of the rules and the discussions at the JSI, and in particular, you shape the rule or you're shaped by them. So there's scope for you to sort of engage in this. I guess what the digital trade inventory tells you that's additional to what's already been said is actually that if you look through it, and the digital trade inventory can allow you to sort of look for your own country and click on the individual country in the compare your country tool, you can see that you're probably already applying many of the issues that are being discussed in the JSI. So actually the cost of engaging in the JSI is probably not as big as you actually think it is. So we think that that's a tool to be able to look at that. So I really do invite you, I'll put it on the chat over here so that you can look at it, but you can click on a particular country that's not a JSI member, and you can see, okay, well, we implemented this UNCITRAL instrument, we have this commitment in this FDA and all that, and because you know that this is set up like the JSI, you'll know that that progress translates to the JSI discussions. The other thing that I want to highlight is that maybe this allows you to sell the JSI domestically a bit more. And I know that there's an interaction between international discussions and domestic discussions, but if you show that domestically you're not actually committing to very much, but you're actually part of those, that's a useful thing. And lastly, on the benefits, I think as Kati was mentioning, and also as Debbie was mentioning, the access to digital inputs is good for your exports, and we have empirical evidence that shows that, but also I think access to digital inputs and implementing these rules allows you to develop your domestic activities a lot more, and your domestic digital activities. And I think that that's something that's forgotten. We often think of either just imports or exports. We also increasingly should be thinking about importing digital inputs to exports, but also about importing digital inputs and using digital inputs to develop domestic capacities. So, to have the infrastructure for the payment system that allows you to engage in some kind of domestic activity. And I think that that's an important area that you get from JSI and from liberalizing in terms of the digital inputs.
And if I may go and second what Javier was saying, I think the investment impacts are very important as well. If you're thinking about investment in digital services and, thinking about countries that have these rules in place versus those that don't, I really think we need to do more work in this, Javier, as kind of economist, but, these digital rules probably have a great deal of value in catalyzing investment in digital services sectors in particular.
Thank you, Kati. And so Johannes as well, the same question. Transparency would seem to be beneficial for all, as we've discussed, but specifically with respect to developing country negotiators, how would you recommend that they use the tools that you've developed and are developing with the Digital Policy Alert?
I hope that with our tools, the activity tracker, and then the detailed mapping that comes in the fourth quarter, we really hope to become an online tool that's it's similar to your own in-house think tank a little bit. So you have the data in front of you. You can take all the sources with you, the official sources, investigate in more detail. With the detailed mapping, we really hope to supply a tool where you can really hone in on the differences in formulation between two policies and reflect on how far you are away from that, as Javier signaled also in his statement there. So I think this is a general ethic of the global trade alert, so that our global public good really alleviates the burden of information for those that can least carry it, and so that we can form governments in small economies, but also the public interest at large, really aware are the difference, what's coming up, and with the activity also that you spot issues that may be most relevant to your constituents back home without having the entire resources deployed to monitor them on your own. And this is where we hope that we can support these constituents with our monitoring tools.
Thanks, Johannes. It really is a public good, I think is the point that stands out for me on that. We have a comment in the chat from Enrique from ICC Sweden, said the interest amongst consumers to protect their personal data seems to be growing by the day. Do you think this could have an effect on the development of digital trade? So question on personal data and data protection. Would anyone amongst the panel, Javier, your hand is raised, please.
Yeah, just because we wrote a recent paper on cross-border data flows, and it has a particular focus, or some parts of it, on personal data protection. And sort of I wanted to add what these mapping exercises, whether it's the one that we've done on the digital trade inventory, or the digital trade alert, or the work that Kathy's been doing with the indicators, all of these also allow you to look at commonalities. And on data protection, we identified that there was actually quite a lot of commonalities. So if you take all the countries, or a range of countries that have data protection rules, and you decompose those data protection rules into their constituent elements, so you know what is in them, you can start looking at how much they overlap and start seeing that there are quite a lot of similarities in these, but also quite a lot of convergence. And here I also see what Kathy was saying with her heat map. We see that in the context of specific issues. So yes, they will shape digital trades, but it's about trying to build on those commonalities so that they shape digital trade in a way that reduces what Raoul, you were saying, that fragmentation that otherwise will affect the ability of firms, not just to protect data, because they have to protect the data from someone in Singapore, from someone in Switzerland, from someone in the US, but also to be able to sell their products to different places. So it affects the digital trade and the business side, but also the ability to protect. So yes, I think it's really, really important. And what's really important is that we recognize these, that we use these mapping instruments that we have in order to build more coherent rules on digital trade that take into account these concerns.
Thanks very much, Javier. Did anyone else want to touch on that question? Deborah.
I would just make two quick points on this one. So one is, be careful of what I would argue is a sort of European bias in this particular regard, which is Europe, yes, cares deeply, a lot of Europeans, let me rephrase that, care deeply about personal information in ways that I'm not convinced that the rest of the world shares the same level of enthusiasm or the same level of concern. So just be a bit careful, I would say, about saying consumers care most about their privacy. Maybe they do, maybe they don't, but I think it's different across different places. The second thing that I would say in the consumer protection space in particular is the challenge that in terms of fragmentation is the sector specific policies around consumer protection are becoming more problematic, which is not that there's a blanket rule that covers personal data protection as such that is so problematic. It's that the health ministry may have its own set of policies around this, or the agriculture department may have a peculiar policy that makes it very challenging to move information, especially related to data, personal data or otherwise, or the finance ministry's got their own rules. And so what we're seeing is domestic level fragmentation around some of these areas as well. And where I really see that in Asia is in the personal data consumer protection space. where we have domestic level fragmentation that is creating another layer of problems for firms who are trying to operate in multiple markets, because you don't just have to know the broad level view, but all of these sector specific policies that are becoming more and more problematic for firms.
Just also to add on this and bring it back also to Javier, I think really what's less salient in talking about privacy is really the commercial dimension, that it may prevent an exporter from accessing a foreign client because they're worried to be exposed to liability risks from that data protection authority, which is obviously enforced by what Deborah is saying, that this could be really much a sector specific issue. And here I think a national fora like the JSI could be useful really to go back to Javier saying, what is the minimum standards that we can agree on, or what could be preconditions for the mutual recognition of our differing domestic data protection standards really? Or if that's not feasible, which is obviously a tall ask, then think about what could be the terms of a safe harbor clause that you can really avoid people getting into these kind of liability exposures too fast. And that's, I think, is one of the classic unintended consequences of the privacy regulation that we see.
Thanks, Johannes.
To maybe complement that a little bit, Raoul?
Yes, sure.
As well, what everybody else is saying. So, of course, these issues are very important for consumers. And as Debbie was saying, we have different biases in different markets, depending where you sit. But at the same time, when we look at the forward-looking agreements and the latest, most robust agreements like CPTPP and USMCA, they have already put in place rules that are about encouraging the member countries to put in place robust privacy laws. And there are also a number of regulations and rules around banning, for instance, spam and unwanted communications and things like that. So, there's quite a lot of thought, I think, put in already in these agreements in these areas. And second, interesting when we ask firms in even markets like Africa, where firms are now entering into e-commerce, what they think about protection of privacy and consumer protection in e-commerce, they really favor it. They favor rules that are these kinds of USMCA, CPTPP type rules to articulate rules for protection of privacy, data privacy, and kind of consumer protection rules in general in online transactions, partly because they want consumers to feel confident that their data is protected, that their transactions are secure in online business. So I don't think there's kind of this. Oftentimes this is painted a little bit like firms versus consumers, and I don't think that's at all the case. Firms really demand these kinds of good, robust rules and clarity of rules so that they can, have confidence with the consumers, and they also have kind of guidance for their own businesses on how to deal with data and data as well as consumer protection issues as they deal with other markets. So I think we've actually gone quite far already in addressing some of these issues.
Thank you very much, Kati. I'm really struck by something, Deborah, you said about the different ministries, different departments having different approaches, and it strikes me that perhaps that should be a topic for another seminar where we can look at, whether it's a statutory body like IMDA in Singapore doing incredible work, or Department of Innovation in another economy, or even a digital tsar or digital champion within government. There are a range of ways that we can improve whole of government approaches to digitization. It's an excellent point there. We've heard a lot today. We've heard about a whole host of opportunities to reduce fragmentation, whether it's the amazing tracking and transparency of the digital policy alert, the comprehensive inventory from the OECD Javier and colleagues have worked on, or indeed lessons from CPTPP, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, and standalone digital economy agreements. To close this out, if I could ask each panelist, what's the 1 minute soundbite takeaway message that you'd like people to come away from this session with? And perhaps if I can start again in alphabetical fashion, let's hear from Deborah.
I think it's that fragmentation matters. It's deeply problematic for firms, and it's of course worse for your smallest firms. And so trying to have consistency of rules and the application of those rules that's consistent is vitally important, or you can't get domestic economies to grow. And coming out of COVID, if there's anything that surely we're all united on, it's the importance of getting domestic level growth back up and going. And if your small firms can't do that, then you're losing a huge opportunity for economic growth and development in the coming few years. So regulatory policies matter more than ever, and consistency is key.
Thanks very much, Deborah. Javier. Okay, let's move to Johannes and come back to Javier.
Back.
Please, Johannes.
Okay, I'll go. So I second obviously Deborah on the topic of fragmentation being the key issue. But for me, also I want to bring the message that the JSI can really build trust and has a very important role in that. Since the digital economy is still a very fast-moving object, unforeseen regulatory issues will come up and keep arising. And we need to build the international communication channels really to coordinate in good faith. And this goes back to one of Deborah's earlier suggestions about the ongoing work program, which I think would be an excellent idea. And also the JSI can promote transparency really to allow broad engagement by your constituents to help really better understand the trade-offs we are facing, because we are having unintended consequences. And that's obviously also where we as the Digital Policy Alert try to do our bit to help the situation.
Thanks very much, Johannes. And Javier. You're on mute, sorry. No, I think you're on mute. Okay, we seem to be having a technical issue with Javier. So in that case, I'll move on to Kati, please.
Well, very little to add after the two interventions we've had, but I think we have such a tremendous historic opportunity now in e-commerce to enable small businesses to finally engage in trade, something that has not been possible for decades. And I think governments need to listen to firms. Firms create trade, not countries don't. And firms are gaining from e-commerce. They're gaining trade opportunities, and they want to do more. They want to diversify their markets, and they want to gain new customers out there. They are realizing the opportunity, but they need better rules. They need more consistent rules, more coherent rules, as well as rules that enable them to export and import goods, services, data, as well as digital goods and services. So, I'm very big on the coherence. We need to have rules that small firms are able to apply consistently and easily across markets, and then rules that enable firms to operate freely with their customers in different markets.
Thank you very much, Kati. And Javier, we'll try once more. No? There's a technical issue. Well, why don't I speak for Javier when I say, log online and look at the OECD Compare Your Country tools on instruments and agreements. And please have a look at the inventory. It is comprehensive. I think it's something like 150 pages of content looking at all of the different provisions. So a huge resource there. And if I can close just by thanking everyone, thanking our esteemed panelists for their time. It's been a really interesting and insightful discussion. We've heard so many different viewpoints. I can only echo what Amgad Shahada has said in the chat, that we're lucky to have such a wealth of experience and knowledge here. Thank you so much. To all the e-commerce JSI negotiators listening in, best of luck, and let's see some great progress at MC12. Okay, thank you everybody, and have a good afternoon.